Good evening, ladies. I'm Corina Ciechano, Vice President, Women and Technology here at Professional Women International. And for the ones that don't know, PWI is the Belgian chapter of PWN Global. And I'm very happy to present today Nicole Dewandre, our speaker. She is advisor to the Director General at DG Connect.
Yes.
She has a very wide
in the
range.
European Commission, everybody knows, yeah.
Excuse me. She has a wide range of studies from engineering, economy, philosophy, very impressive. And I'll let you introduce yourself and the subject more in detail. You will be talking about being human in a hyper-connected era.
Right.
So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Corina, for giving me this opportunity to share ideas with you. And I think this is the first time I will present this to a woman-only audience, which is interesting because I think there is really something about thinking as women in what I have to propose, which is greatly inspired by Hannah Arendt thinking. And I think it's not by accident that this type of thinking came out of a women's mind. So, being human in a hyper-connected era, I think that it's important to try to think at what is the nature of what we live today. Often we speak of the fact that things are changing fast. When we insist on speed, I think that to some extent it means we don't grasp what's happening. Because speed you cannot beat. I mean, we will not be able to think at the speed of the electron anyway. So if we have only speed to describe what happens, that means we didn't follow exactly what is happening. So I try to get away from using speed as an explanation or an excuse, although I recognize things move fast, but I don't think it's very helpful when you want to anchor and think what is happening to us. So we come from a moment where, of course, there was no online at all. We have recently witnessed a widening of the online world with, a few gates, of course, between when you sit in front of your desktop, then you are between offline and online. But these two worlds were separated. And in policy-making world, because I, of course, will address this from a policy-making point of view, we had, for example, a directive and regulation on commerce, and then we had an e-commerce. We had privacy, we had e-privacy. So we sort of try to complete the offline regulation with what needs to be done online. But this approach has limits, and we are now, in fact, at the very moment, of course, this is exaggerating, but in terms of realization, I think that continuing to think that we have two layers stop to be efficient. We cannot think anymore these two worlds in a distinct manner. When you think of e-commerce issue, you have the problem of parcel delivery, for example, so which is very concrete and comes quick on the table. And this comes from, in fact, the trend, what is putting that now, and this is what we call on life, or because it's really between offline and online. The number of gates here is so much, there are so many that, you have to take them in one go. And that's what I call hyperconnectivity, is the fact that online falls into the offline world, and you cannot distinguish them as layered environment. And if we want to, that's my proposal, it may be too harsh and we can discuss about that, I think it results in a way in, and this of course is due to what? To the fact that we have mobile access to internet, an explosion of the number of devices, and also the Internet of Things, so that not only people communicate together, but things and objects will communicate together, and all this in an ubiquitous way. Mark Weiser in 1991 had written an interesting article in Science saying that, in fact, we come from a period where we had mainframe computer, these big things with punch cards and all that. Then we went to the portable computer environment, and he was seeing at the time, 91, so the internet just has risen. He had anticipated the moment where ubiquitous computing is really where all sensors, devices, computers are so small that they are invisible. They are really integrated in the environment. So these trends that were anticipated by him, this multiplication, explosion of device, miniaturization, Internet of Things, and mobile and ubiquitous access, is really what makes now, creates a situation where we have to think off and online together and cannot go like we used to go. That means bringing online into our world as an add-on. This on-life environment can be characterized by two main changes. One is the fact that social interaction are sticky now. So we still have in mind this Latin motto, which is verba volant, scripta manent. It's totally wrong, you know. Now everything stays. If I speak, if I am here with you, so that by default interaction in all their forms are recorded or recordable and searchable. So that really creates a sort of situation where, if I take the metaphor of the physics and the gravity, the 9.81 acceleration of the gravitation, it is, if you transpose this into social networking, social life, it is as if we had to learn to live with a social hypergravity. How are we going to live knowing that our interaction will be, are recorded, potentially logged in, and we need to feel free in that environment. That means we cannot continue to think, if I'm not taken, it's good enough, or how are we going to embrace this? So this is a radically changing thing that I think can be anticipated, and we don't need to say that things are going fast. We are not there yet, but we are going there somehow. So we can start to think the consequence and also observe what philosophy has said about it, because philosophers have anticipated quite a lot of things that we are experiencing now in our lay experience. The second big distinction is that the environment is becoming reactive and talkative. We will have, it's funny to see that we call smart device just when they do what they're expected to do, which is a strange way to look at what smart is. And I used to say that you say a smart fridge when it says when there is no milk, but when the women do that, they're not necessarily deemed to be smart. It's considered a stupid task. So, but I think that this is because maybe the pride of those having programmed the fridge and organized all this to call it smart. But we are also, again, an hypothesis, going towards something which is a reactive and talkative environment. And we have the need to orient ourselves within that environment, as I will come. So, if we accept that this is the sort of essence of what we are witnessing today, so the task of our generation is to adapt to that new environment that is coming to us, it allows to frame things in a different way than saying that there is a time lag, that society needs time to adapt and all that. Yes, of course, we need time to adapt, but there is no time to waste before we coin and we frame new concepts and we rethink. What do we mean by privacy? What do we mean by identity? What do we mean by freedom in these new conditions? So, yes, this is about the change that we are witnessing. We can go a bit deeper in analyzing this change. What is it that happens to us? And why does it matter? So the first thing is the blurring of the distinction between reality and virtuality. And I think it's important to see how this distinction is important for us, and when I mean us, is us as citizens, but for policy making. I draw from the sophist approach to politics, where sophists used to say that it's important to behave when you are in public, even, and they admit there is a form of hypocrisy, which Plato thought it was not good hypocrisy, but I think that we have to have some fragmentation, because otherwise you cannot put together the fact that you are free to have phantasm in your own mind and intimacy, and then that you have to behave in public and when you appear in front of others. So we come from a period where it was easy to distinguish between reality and virtuality, and between those moments where you have to behave and those moments where you are free to phantasm, and where with now the blurring of the distinction between reality and virtuality, it's difficult to see where we put the norm. So that if we put the norm, if we ask all of us to behave in virtual worlds like we do in real world, we may go to Puritanist approach, an excessive Puritanist approach. If we go the other way around, this will be an excessive license. So I think that there continue to be a need for making the distinction, but we have to ground it in new terms. We have to see what makes a difference. And to take an example, it goes deep into moral issue and ethical approach. For the moment, because, for example, you couldn't do child pornography without hurting a child, then you say that child pornography is wrong, even the desire of it, so to speak. Now, if you go with synthetic image, for example, which doesn't hurt anybody, you could consider, okay, if it's just something that comes out of the mind, but if it is done without consequence for anybody, we may decouple or not. I don't know. I'm just saying that this linkage that we were doing, that some behavior were hurting others, if it's not anymore the case, how are we going to judge them? So it's quite destabilizing and for our moral judgments. The second distinction is the distinction between human artifact and nature. We used to identify nature as virgin nature, what has not been built, artifact, what has been built, what men and women brought into the world, and human was to be distinguished from artifact, because to have human right and distinguished from nature also. So there is here something like a modern distinction that are blurring. And it's not new, it's only that ICT are accelerating the blurring of this distinction. You know, artifact and nature have started to interact with the energy and the machine and the thermodynamic and the engines. Human and artifact, when we have put a pacemaker, when we have glasses. So none of this distinction used to be watertight. But with ICT, again, we are really accelerating the distinction, the blurring of this distinction. And it is a problem for the following reason, that we consider that we are responsible for artifact, and we are not responsible when it comes about nature. When there is a tsunami, if we can predict, it's good, but nobody is responsible of that. When there is the blow up of a bomb, of course we are responsible. So there is an incidence on the remit of responsibility here. But now, with the fact that this is blurring, so to speak, and this is what environmentalists call Anthropocene, because we cannot distinguish anymore virgin nature from what it becomes because of the artifacts that are in there. The distinction between artifact and nature has also to be re-grounded in different terms. The two last things that happens is the flip over. So this is blurring of this binary distinction, blurring of this ternary distinction, and then we have flip-flop, how should I say? Of a world where information was considered scarce to a moment where it's overabundant. We have recognized a distinction between renewable resources and non-renewable resources, information is an exponential resource, so it's a sort of third kind. And with information becoming overabundant, we become orphan of the encyclopedic ideal. Because I think when I sort of interpret what I hear around me, that we still have this sort of omniscience, omnipotence utopia, that if or when we'll be able to know about everything, then we'll be able to act perfectly, that there is a link. Often problems are framed in lack of knowledge, or maybe this is because I work in the research policy and because we argue for more money for research, we put this forward, I don't know, but from where I sit, I observe these links between more knowledge will lead to perfect action or better action. So this starts from an environment, from a frame where information is scarce and more information is better. Now, philosophy has started to deconstruct this vision by saying that there is no objective standpoints and no where you cannot consider knowledge as something that recovers reality and will end up duplicating it totally. But now we all do this experience that it's not possible to be on top of things. We navigate on the internet, we are overwhelmed by information, and we really feel very concretely that what matters is filter. What are the filters that we are using? What are the good filters? So it's not of adding on information, not so much access to information, but much more, okay, what are the good filters? And this brings a totally different perspective to the relationship to information. And there again, objectivity has been deconstructed by philosophy, but in terms of common sense, it still was a sort of good proxy of, being on top of things. But really now, our experience is that we have to abandon this. And the last, the fourth main shift, or a fourth important shift, is the shift from the primacy of entities over interaction to now the primacy of interactions over entities. So that you could say that entities are like roundabouts. We are defined by the result of who we interact with. So the primary thing is interaction, and we are the result of interaction. What is the signature of the fact that for the moment entities comes first and interaction comes second in our way to think? If I take the policy-making world again, we tend to spend a lot of time defining what is a member state, an entity. And then, in terms of interaction, they are quite poorly addressed. Either we want to organize free flow, or we want to have walls. It's quite binary. We speak of barrier. A barrier is up or down. But the sort of richness of interaction is not really taken into account. At EU level, for example, we speak a lot about fragmentation. And I tell often to my colleague that fragmentation is a word, when you put such a word, it creates a field of meanings. Fragmentation means it was better before because it was one piece and now it's broken. Fragmentation is it comes out of a piece that was a global piece. So when we say fragmentation, it's looking at interaction between the fragments only you look for a glue and you want to make this interaction just disappear, which is not how we need to look at interaction. So the focus only on size tends to not look enough at what are the interactions, how can they be of good quality. Paying more attention to the quality of interaction will really become, I think, the key thing for efficiency. So stewardship is more important than leadership. Again, a gender issue. that we have to look at stewardship in a more positive way, maybe than leadership. If we take all these four things, so you see the blurring of reality virtuality, the blurring of human artifact nature, the flip-flop of scarcity and abundance when it comes to information, and the reversal of the primacy of entity over interaction to the primacy of interaction over entities, it can be grasp as follows. That we come from a moment where we used to say the sky is the limit, to have this modern Promethean attitude. With sustainability issues, in the last century, we learned to bring down that notion and realize that the Earth is the limit. And it may well be that, in fact, with hyperconnectivity, the self becomes the limit. Because we realize that our finite time of attention, the capacity to read and write, the capacity to interact, we are concretely put in a situation where we realize that we could have to spend our time just deleting mail we don't want to read, for example. There is something where we feel the pressure, like a Vasarely, where what was in the background becomes in the foreground. There is a real shift there. So that wondering what is a self, and this consciousness of the self becomes more and more important, which doesn't mean being selfish. And there I come with my proposal that in fact hyperconnectivity is the name we can give to postmodernity. In philosophy, in literature, in science, we know we speak of postmodernity. We know we have left modernity behind. In policy making, we are still anchored in modern visions. We still speak in cause and effect, command and control. We try to anticipate impacts. We are really ground into classical mechanic perceptions, top down, bottom up, all these things. It's amazing. And so we are still modern in policy making. But when you use the word postmodern, that means you remain anchored in modernity. So I think we should dare give a name to postmodernity. And I think that name is hyperconnectivity. The problem also when you say that, I hear is what Foucault called the blackmailing of the Enlightenment, is that when you say that you're out of modernity, people fear that you go back to Middle Age. So they say, oh yes, but I'm not saying that modernity is bad, it's just an era and we are out of it. So that if we want to think in appropriate terms, we need to realize that we have to step in hyperconnectivity way of thinking and leave behind modernity. So when I hear sometimes, still we use the word modernization, and I send them, when you say modernization, it is like as if we were saying archaization, you see? Modernization cannot be updating. Updating now is something else than modernization. So, and this is a ratio, I will suggest you a ratio. Simple, just to put concepts in relations. The central role that objectivity is playing when we speak of sound-based policy, and the fact that we are still very much focused on objectivity because we think subjectivity is necessarily bias and distortion. So objectivity is still a key word. And when we think what does it mean or what does it entail, it's the fact that you're supposed to grasp things from outside yourself. In fact, when you are striving to an objective mode, you are transparent to yourself. This is the goal, the posture. And with hyperconnectivity, what is important, you remember the self is the limit, is to tame or to appropriate, to get used to live in the company of the self. And to be fair in that also with this constraint. So reflectivity will, in hyperconnectivity, play the role objectivity has placed for modernity. And so the challenge now is really to see how we position knowledge, how we interact with each other, how we transform the environment, but always with the consciousness of the self, and so from within. And the shift from modernity to hyperconnectivity is really a shift about the representation of interactions. So there you see the fourth shift of the primacy from entity to interaction, and the importance of interaction. So really, interaction, reflexivity, consciousness of the selves are, I think, key word to to empower us to live this era. With that, with that framing that we are stepping in hyperconnectivity, that to embrace it we need to domesticate and appropriate reflexivity as we used to domesticate objectivity, I will suggest a new way to say what it is to be human. That's how I come there. So sometimes, I attend conference on computer ethics and I see excited experts wondering when the robots will become human. And then I say to them once, but you seem so excited, but in fact the question is flawed. Because we are thinking of human as if they were a machine since a long time. So it's only because we do that this question is possible. So in fact, it's a false suspense, if you understand what I mean. It's no point to wonder when the computer will become a machine. And when you see the Turing test and recently a 13-year-old boy was fooled by, you've heard about that anecdote? So Alan Turing is a genius of last century who has suggested that distinguishing a man from a computer, always worried about this question, do we consider a computer as a person or not? The question was, a computer should be considered as a person if me, a person, I am behind a screen, and there are behind the screen a person but typing on a computer and a computer on its own. And if when I chat, I consider that the natural language and response of the computer, I'm fooled and I think this is the conversation of the person. If I am fooled, that means the computer can be deemed to be a person. Okay, I think that, again, this way to define what it is to be human on a fooling thing is not, well, I don't want to buy that approach. So I think we need to do it otherwise. And the way philosophers, when we define humanity as people with reason, for example, or the logos, it's true that if we associate reason with algorithm, we cannot define human on only on this capacity, because then computers are already human, and we know this is not the case. Another characteristic of what it is to be human was to be speaking, but of course the language, the relationship between the language and the machine who can speak is not the same as what was grasped when we say that what is a human is a speaking being. Is it that you are made of flesh or of artifact? Is difficult to say, because if you have a prosthesis, is it a percentage of flesh compared to a percentage of material? Where do you stop? So I think that's a no-go either. So all these ways to try to define what it is to be human are flawed, because they are all approaches which just ignore one thing which is those trying to make this distinction are human themselves. So it's not being egotist or selfish or narrow-minded to remember that we cannot pretend to define what it is to be human if we forget that we are human. And that someone who is not human, and who may come at one day on Earth, I don't know, would do differently, maybe. But if we try to do it as if how such creator would do it, I think we will turn around and miss something. So, to suggest a way to define what it is to be human, I draw on Arendt, as I said, and on her trilogy. She distinguished labor, work, and action. Have you heard about Arendt? Do you know her? She's a woman who lived in the last century. She is born in Germany, and she was a pupil of Heidegger. She studied philosophy, and then she left Germany in 1933 because she realized that it was becoming difficult for her. She stayed in France, where she was in a camp, and she managed to go to the United States that she reached in 41. And there she became a US citizen in 1951. And she's written her first book in 51, yes, The Origin of Totalitarianism, and then The Human Condition in 58. In The Human Condition, and there was a movie recently that was done about her, yeah. A great thinker. Okay, so she distinguished three activities: labor, work, and action. For her, labor, this is just a parenthesis because you will see how that draw on that. Labor is the activity that we do because we are biological beings. So this is what we do by necessity. Our heart is beating, we don't order that. We have to eat, otherwise we die, we reproduce ourselves, we clean ourselves. So for her, this is what she calls labor. So labor is what we do without any freedom, just because we are alive. And this is what she thinks needs to be done at home. Then the work is, this is what you can plan and execute. So the work is the activity that you decouple. I want this table, I will go and cut a tree and then do it. Okay, so work is a type of activity that you engage with, that you anticipate, and then you get to the result. So it's a instrumentality register is what you control and what you anticipate. This is work. It's a means to an end logic. And the third type of activity, and she doesn't say that one is better than the other, but I think it helps to distinguish these registers. So labor, necessity, no beginning, no end. Work, a beginning and an end, a means to an end logic. And the third one is action. And action, this is for her what is inherently political. Action is what happens between people because we are plural. And it is what happened between people without instruments. So her ideal was, this is what happened when in the Greek city. So this was between men, when women and slaves were at home in the private space. And for her, these men, once they were freed from necessity, were able to experience freedom by appearing among their peers, because they were beyond their level of society. This is what mattered for her. You can only be free beyond your level of society. So a being which doesn't recognize their own level of society cannot be free. So action is that third political type of activity. It's mainly through speech and appearing in front of others and sending back who they are, as well as accessing who we are. Now, so labor, work, action, okay? Okay, I turn this labor, work, action into recognizing that there are three forms of otherness now. One is this vertical otherness. This is when you consider the other as an object, something that is a result of work, something that you fabricate. And if you did not fabricate, something that you deem, you pretend you know because you can fabricate, you can replicate, you can. So this is when the self lives him or herself as a manipulative being. And there I love to cite Mary Midgley, another women thinker, which is a moral philosopher, a British. And she said that birds have two legs and the two anterior members are wings, so they are flying beings. And we have two legs and our anterior members are hands, so we are manipulative beings. It's real characteristics of men and women, like flying is characteristics of birds. It's not that we cannot fly, it is that we manipulate. So manipulation is not wrong necessarily, but this is when we have the vertical otherness, is when I engage with an other, which is, to my understanding, an object. That means it's an instrument, it's instrumentality. It's characterized by what it is and how it functions. it has to be predictable. So the fluid that circulates in the relationship between me and another, when the other is an object, is control. This is where I want, I expect, I seek control. This is vertical otherness. But it is only one form of otherness. There is two other forms. The second form of otherness is when we recognize the other as an other self. So this is when the self experiences him or herself as a plural being. And Aret said, she said that, I will say after I explain what plurality means, because plurality is a technical term for her, which is quite precisely defined. It's made of three characteristics. The first one is equality. So she doesn't define the other, the human, as only as equal. And for her, the equality is a starting point. It's not the equality as we used to consider it in the political terms now, which is an objective, and which force to think equality and sameness in a same way. So we are in difficulty with that. So she says equality this is a fact. We start from that. It's not an objective. We are of the same kind. And if we don't consider another self of someone of the same kind, you yourself get out of humanity. It's not that you push the other one out of it. So that's the first characteristic. The second is, and it's an interesting dynamic between the two, that we are unique. So we are equal and unique. Because we are all unique, so we are equal in the fact that we are unique. And what matters is the who. So this is to be distinguished from the what in the vertical otherness. And the third thing, which put everything together in a nice way, is this reflectivity. She said that the identity has the characteristics of being like a diamond character, something that is in my neck here that I don't see, and you see more surely than I do. So that part of who I am, I can only access because I appear among you. In fact, it says that we are all living behind our face. We spend our life behind our face, and the face is what we are our face for others, but we live behind it. And this is the relationality, and the fact that identity is not something that you can control. If you want to control what you deliver, you will only be perceived as someone who wants to control, and you will not control. So there is this sort of thing that you cannot control. This relationship is inherently different from the vertical otherness where I control, because here we all have the power to begin. And she locates freedom in the power to begin also. So these three characteristics, that we are of the same kind and we have a society level, we are unique and we are relational in the sense that we depend from others to know who we are. This is exactly what is plurality. And I think that when we recognize that we are in a plural, this plurality is a key feature of what it is to be human. This defines another form of otherness, which is the horizontal otherness. And in a horizontal otherness, I cannot anticipate what will happen. Because, of course, I appear, I make a proposal, and then I depend from what each of you will do. And this is true to some extent also between member states, for example. As soon as you have these three things, and when you think of the status of member states around the European Council table, you may say they are equal because they're all member states. Some are big, some are small, yes. But in their nature, they want to project their identity. They have this sameness. They are specific. They don't want to be considered only for their power, number of inhabitants, or GDP per capita, or whatever. Of course, they will put this forward sometime, but they would not like to be reduced to that. It is the who matters. And they need to appear in front of each other in the fora of the European Council or in the UN or elsewhere to nurture this identity, otherwise it would disappear. It doesn't exist by itself if it is not recognized by others. So to some extent, this conversation between member states can also be seen as a discussion between agents, I would say, more than humans, and is in the mode of horizontal otherness. Oops, sorry, this here. And so you see the point that to distinguish humans from artifacts, the point is not to distinguish them from an outside, try to find a criterion, for example, for distinguishing them, saying that it's the nature, but using this word nature is tricky, but say that it is either because you have man-made artifact. I found this funny because when I'm very sensitive to language, and when I see man-made, I always wanted to translate and say person-made, or there was no feminine version of it. And I thought, but if you make it feminine, then you get humans, because what is women-made so far, and I don't know for how long, but still, that cannot be the way we distinguish, nor is it the level of autonomy, because you read things like that, for example, if robots were self-learning, we would have to consider them as humans, because they would escape control. So, and I think this is that it's too short. For me, if a robot escapes control, like a satellite becomes a star again, or I don't want to consider such an artifact out of control as another self, because I don't think it's something equal, unique, and who send me back, who help me accessing who I am. So it's not that, but it is about the type of otherness at play. So am I engaging with that other on the vertical otherness or on the horizontal otherness mode? And to be on horizontal otherness, we need to be conscious of our society. And this is also another problem. I will come to this with the modern values that we have. So, that's the core of the proposal, to distinguish human from artifact. So this I mentioned, the being human is relational selves, partly blind to ourselves, which is not a default. If we were not partly blind to ourselves, if we were omniscient and omnipotent, if we had eyes behind, we would stop being human. I propose to say that to the floor, just to have some statement clear. And and this is true for these people in the European Council, as it is true for any group of friends around the table. Oh yeah, and the free and social is important. Because again, what I see around me often is when we speak of freedom, we say whatever I want, sort of out of context. And social, when we see that we are a social being, then this is often used to see how we can enroll others into our own goals, how we can incentivize, so that the relationality is considered as a Trojan horse for enrollment. And we have difficulty to embrace in the same movement the fact of being free and our relationality. And this, if we want to push the democracy and freedom in a hyperconnected era, we will have to hold this together, free and social and relationality. So, thinking the interaction with this way to look at the plurality and to having present at the mind always so this horizontal otherness, so the sameness, uniqueness and relationality, the fact that we speak to each other and we are all behind our face, helps, I think, enriching our way to look at interaction. Because so far we are bound in what is a reductionist approach to interaction, I think. If you look at the invisible hand metaphor, Of course, it's okay if it is to say that there is no omnipotent being that can know better from one place and organize everything for all of us. This is true. So again, the big plan, yes. But there is a side effect of the invisible hand, which is a decoupling of our own balance that we all host between caring for oneself and empathy for others. We have this sort of fort intérieur and balance within ourselves. With the invisible hand, it's a brainwash to say, look for your own interest, and by doing so, you will care for the interests of all. So there is sort of the denial of the role of the empathy for someone else. That it is also part of ourselves. And the problem is that, okay, we use the invisible hand metaphor in policy, economy, thinking, but then when we see what happens in a court, when we have someone who really behaves like that, that means doesn't care for anybody around and only strive their own interest, they are deemed to be psychotic. So I think there is something we need to question there. When we promote a system, or when a system is promoted on the basis of something that cannot be translated in the human acceptance, human environment, so to speak, the human values. Here, the Montesquieu and the fact that the only way to reach the equilibrium between power is to neutralize them. So this has a very deep adversarial framing. This considers that by definition, a power will lead to an abuse of power, and so that interaction are only meant to be neutralizing each other. And this is also a little bit what you say when you say my freedom is limited, stops where you begins. It's also framing things in adversarial way. A little bit like a Brownian movement, or where everything, in fact, where it's okay because it's sort of neutralizing each other. The notion of progress that we have from the modern era, and this notion that more is better, again, like we did here, to see that this brainwash of putting aside empathy as something that would hinder your optimization and your strategy. The more is better. In human world, obesity and greed, you cannot have a horizontal plurality with someone who has never enough. So that there is a real issue to see how we think of the coexistence. We speak of the tension between cooperation and competition, but as human, we have this society level and the recognition of the fact that at one point we have enough, and the goal is not always to have more. Because otherwise, you're okay, but you're just not a nice friend to have around the table. So that's also something to be thought about. And with all that, the interaction, the plurality, the notion of horizontal otherness, I think, complete all this mechanical metaphor that I don't say we should push away, only know that they are a partial approach and that we need to complete it. Humans artifacts, so this is two forms of otherness. There is a third one. The one is circular otherness, because we said other as another self, the other as an object. We have also the other as the environment, because we are not omnipotent, omniscient. We enter into an environment, and that means that this is when the other is neither another self nor something that we control. And this is not necessarily catastrophic. When we tend to forget that there is this type of otherness, the global one, either we need to control or we are unequal, but we are missing something there. So, see here, the fluid of when you are in a horizontal otherness, it's with attention, and the question you answer is, who are you? Here, the what is it, control, when you are in vertical otherness, and the circular otherness is orient yourself, where am I? And again, the problem is when we conflate control and orientation. Often when we speak of, for example, data control and all this, we tend to mix control and orientation and not distinguish them, when sometimes what we need to be able to do is to orient ourselves, not to control necessarily. So, stepping in hyperconnectivity means getting out of the fact to be totally harnessed for the moment in this one-dimensional approach to otherness. For the moment, I think that we can only, because we think everything in terms of cause and effect, we are only reading what happens in vertical otherness, so that either we are in control, and if we are not in control, we are controlled. It's one or the other, often. And if you see the debate on the surveillance, for example, and all this, it's often always framed in this way. So I control or I am controlled. So that you end up, if you have only this form of otherness, you consider that the only way to get out of this is to spend your time to control that you're not controlled. So this is really awful. So it's important, again, I appreciate vertical otherness, for example, particularly when with my car, I go over a bridge. I appreciate that it has been measured to hold. I appreciate that the elevators are okay. So there is a lot of situation where we enjoy vertical otherness. But we have to remember that we have always the two other forms of otherness, and then in situations, we have the three forms combining with each other. So plurality is when we are here, the other is human, and natality, this is to say that the world I'm entering in, I don't need to refer it always to what it was centuries ago. I can start from where I am, and we have to see where we are and where we take it from here. Not always dream of starting back or yes. So, but maybe it's if you, it's too long to enter into this in detail. But if you wish, we can do this later. And you recognize here the basis of a vectorial space. And what I like with this metaphor of the basis of a vectorial space is that these three other forms of otherness combine themselves. So that when you are in a situation, always think, okay, what is it that I control? What is it that I need to orient myself within? And who is it that I am interacting with on a horizontal way? And when I am at the cashier of the supermarket, there is some form of vertical otherness when I interact with the lady across the counter, but there is also a horizontal otherness dimension, so that we are here in this space, for example. And yes, the fact that we have this one, the global otherness, and to start from where we are, I think is important to avoid hyper-responsibility. Because if we pretend that we are responsible for everything that we have changed, then we cannot cope. It's too much, and then we sort of give up completely. So for the moment, social science tend to make a link, and they, against the determinism, they show that things are socially constructed. You have this on the gender debate also, the distinction between what is nature, what is culture, and all that. But I think that with plurality, we have to learn to recognize the effect and impact of us being on Earth without feeling that there is a control-Z function that we could undo, redo. That what happens is corresponding to a plan. Because as Arendt says, when something has happened, you necessarily rationalize it afterwards. You will produce a story. That's the only way we can live through things. But where life and story differ from science and classical mechanics in particular, is that in classical mechanics or in statistics, when you observe something, a law, you just change the signal and you say, okay, if it applies in the past, I can predict what will come in the future. I just, change the direction of the time. This is not true in human affairs. So that things that happen emerge and is a fruit of our interaction, but cannot be read as something that was anticipatable and controlled by someone. There again, it's an abuse of vertical otherness reading, so to speak. And Yeah, so, and it's important to decouple socially constructed from what can be controlled, because then you can recover the proper scope of responsibility and not pretend to be responsible for beyond what we are responsible. And then also to bring meaning as a compass. We are too much focused on efficiency only. By that, we sort of turn ourselves into computers and machines, and we forget that we are beings in need of meaning, which is also a characteristic, because she insists a lot of the need to think. So reclaiming thinking side by side with knowledge. And this morning in the Belgian newspaper, Julia Kristeva is in Brussels tonight, and she, the title in the newspaper was that she insists on the need to think. And this importance on the thought is really something that I read in Arendt. Virginia Woolf is putting this forward too. I see Kristeva. This importance of thinking, because we tend to think of knowledge society, and we consider that from knowledge to action there is a sort of direct axis, but the role of thinking in between is really important and maybe not recognized enough and put forward by these women thinkers. I come to more concrete thing. Is okay or okay? This is toward the end, the last part, with a sort of concrete application of this new way of thinking or embracing the era, hyperconnected era, is to recognize that the way we discuss privacy is again still anchored in modernity. As follows: it is sort of based on a home-agora divide. Even if scholars recognize that there is privacy in public and that in the home a child may feel more in a private, in an anonymous environment than home, but we still have this as a reference. The way we approach privacy is really framed around data. Humans are not humans, they're data subjects and data manager. And the principle that were coined in the early 80s to define what privacy means were the two principles of data control and data minimization. Data control is that each data subject has a right to control and access their personal data. And when a data controller processes personal data, they have to announce in advance what is the purpose, and then only do that for that purpose, otherwise erase the data and discard them. So this is called data minimization. You see that this, of course, was thought about when having in mind the post-World War II and the Stasi, and so that it was to protect against the state. But now that we live in a big data, that we live behind our self-digital shadow, which whatever we do, this notion that privacy can be translated into me having access to my personal data, if I ask my personal data, I don't know what flow of data I will receive and what I will do with it. And the data minimization, clearly the big data environment is an environment where data becomes a new air, so to speak, oxygen. And people we are striving to have new activities, open data, open government. So how can you say that you have to announce in advance what you do with your data? It's exactly against the tide. So these two principles are principles that used to be relevant in another environment. Now we cannot change them in a sort of authoritative way. There is not on the shelf alternative. We as a society are now fabricating new ones. We know these are fragile, but new ones are emerging. And we have to look for these new ones. What are they? We continue for the moment to pay a lot of attention on consent. And of course, if we were asked each time if we consent, we would be totally invaded by requests for consent, and we don't want that. And we continue, we have a trade-off framing, pretending that we can reach security if we abandon privacy because someone will be able to know everything about us and then protect us, so to speak. but this framing is also very much modern and based on control. So, privacy is a concept in transition. I want to, especially in this forum, but I do this also in front of men, and they get it. And I must say, I'm quite struck that I was slow in getting this. I don't know. You tell me if it rings a bell for you or not. Geneviève Fraisse, another interesting woman philosopher, still alive, and a French one, commented on Rousseau, where she said that when Rousseau wanted to decouple the private from the public, it was so that the men are equal in public but remain dominant at home, because they didn't want to have this philosophy at home of equality. So this is where the decoupling of the private and the public came about. So that the home state divides and the fact that privacy is I do what I want in my home is something that was made up for men. Women encounter more violence at home than in the streets. This is put forward by Geneviève Bell, which is an anthropologist working for Intel, and she has written a book with Paul Durish, where she says that. She says it's this notion of home sweet home. Again, if you look at facts and you see the size of the domestic violence, that indeed for women, home is not this place where it's so quiet, except if you fully alone. But so there again, the fact that of course with the double day and the conciliation between work and family, this is where we have a second working day often, and the fact that staying at home for us was a sort of I feel connected with it. I don't know you, but I feel connected with the fact that we were confined in homes before, so that access to public is a right, and I prefer to fight to keep the access to the public than I feel the need to say, please don't come in. And public space is a place where freedom is experienced. So what is quite astonishing is that, I don't blame, of course, men for having framed privacy along their own needs, but I think we should get out of our silence. For the moment, women have not framed what it is that they need. We have needs, but would we call it even privacy? I don't know. I think intimacy is a word that gets some things in, and I would claim that men and women have this shared dual need of both intimacy on the one hand and recognition. We are in need of both exposure and shelter. I must admit I don't know. Arendt speak about that a little bit, and I don't know. I need to explore in social science where it's approached, but the fact that we are not transparent, we need to hide, not to hide, or to have shelter in some circumstances that Arendt put are linked with our biological needs. I don't know, but something to be thought here. But I think that basing on this dual need of intimacy and recognition, so where she says this is labor and this is action, you see, with work in between. There is something. Also the need to distinguish orientation and control. Control is when you want to, you are in vertical otherness. This is when you want to go to know where you are in an environment that you don't control. So where am I? When I am in a hyper-connected environment, I need to know, where am I, and recognize when I am recognized. This is a feature that is important for our social life, to know if we are anonymous or if we are recognized. It's also important to know if we enter an environment that doesn't care for us, or if the environment adapts to us. All these are things that are important in the non-digital world, pre-digital world, and that we may need to reconstruct the way to have this feature in a hyper-connected era, which has little to do with control. So privacy and hyperconnectivity. is I suggest to move from, we have these words all the time at the Mouse, saying transparency and control, but I think they were the way that we used to translate respect and fairness in modern era. To think that to be fair to someone is to be transparent was a way to speak in modern terms. But with the non-transparency of the self, we need to know what it is to be respectful and fair in our interaction. Surely avoid fooling, I would say, is an invariant that stays around. And in the pre-digital world, there is social norms and regulation, unfair commercial practices, for example, directive. And only on the full day, we are sort of allowed to fool each other and try to. But the other day, we should abstain. And this is important for the plurality, because it's precisely because we depend from others to orient ourselves and know who we are, that fooling each other is really also getting out of a human behavior. So that this is exactly the work that we are doing now as a society, is to define the conditions for this contextual integrity and how can we ensure that we translate respect and fairness in a hyper-connected era. For example, the practice of dynamic pricing, how much will we go when we buy a ticket, for example, we don't know if the price we offer depends or not of the fact that the provider knows who we are. Do we consider as society that this is okay or not? To be discussed. And so this is a gray zone, you see, between the consumer policy, so the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive on the one hand, and data protection regulation. Because so far we tend to consider everything only under data protection. So this is leaving the individual and his or her data kingdom around him or her alone. To address the relationality of the problem is to bring other policy in. So, and when I say that this rethinking of what does privacy mean, is it intimacy, how do we shift from transparency and control to respect and fairness, we need to do the same rethinking for the notion of identity, the notion of responsibility, as I have approached, the power, what is democracy, and all this. And all this is really reshaping literacy in a wide sense. Someone said, to see what is the literacy in the pre-digital world, when we learn to write and speak, it's not only about the skills, technical skills, but it is about what I say to the ear of someone hoping it's not heard further, or what I say to my parents and not to my friends, or the other way around. And we, as kids, we have learned painfully when something went wrong in this thing, and the guy, Vedias, who wrote The Googlization of Everything, he said, taking this example and pointing to the fact that these social skills is what he calls the extended literacy. And he says, when it comes to the internet, we are all babies. So that managing our privacy setting is only the tip of the iceberg, the beginning, of course. But what happens with all this data? What does Facebook do of this data? How do they come back? So for the moment, all this layer of activity is something that we didn't develop the sort of general knowledge or comfort with this. And this is a conclusion. Attention. If you still have a spare attention for me, I know I abused a lot. But in fact, what is new is the scarcity of attention. The fact that the self is the limit is also recognizing that our attentional space are not only scarce, but fragile and vulnerable. And for the moment, again, still the signature of the fact that we are still in modern framing and we should move on, we only think of the economic approach to attention. It is recognized that we pay for free services on the internet because we have an attention pocket, so to speak, and we decide to allocate attention to this ad, so I get this for free. This is recognized. But what is not enough recognized is the need to have an ecological approach. That means to pay attention to the pollution of attention. I think that we would really dissolve our freedom and pleasure to be in plurality if we were polluting our attentional space. This is really a way to cancel the fact of enjoying being together. You see, the torture is to distract the attention all the time of someone. You know, turn the light on every 5 minutes, or having and so that we really have to think how we develop this ecological approach to attention to mitigate the pollution of attention. Because, and this is digital anthropologists who say that, we as human beings have this a priori characteristics of paying attention. If you see someone in the street, this is also a thing of the same kind, dimension of Arendt. If someone is doing like that, you will look. So if we abuse of that capacity that we all have, we will then become we will have to become indifferent to others. And that would be very, very problematic. And then the political approach is to recognize that, okay, it used to be a time where the power and control was over space, then it was over time, now it's over attention. You see in management process and all this, and you see that when you try to go first, the real luxury is to be able to control your attention. But you see that when you try to capture the attention too much, we all develop strategies to escape. So we have to see how we recognize the need for each of us to remain in control of our own attention to some extent. And I know I use the word control here. I don't know if I should use this one or if there is a better one. So, attention. The fact that because we have a scarce attention, we cannot read terms and conditions, and we don't. We know that now. This means that transparency is not enough. We cannot pretend as policymakers we delivered if providers are just asked to be transparent, because it's not enough. The question is meaningful choice. How? So it all become, when I was saying that new principles are coming, it is, for example, through finding icons as a new vocabulary. What are the options that we will offer to people? The data protection regulation, for example, call for designing such option and new icons that will become a new vocabulary. And the fairness in time, again, scarcity of attention. So when we interact in a hyperconnected world, we see this when we have the automatic menu on the phone, and always you have to spend a lot of time to wait before you can push on what you need and all that. So fairness there has to also take into account not only money but time. And with all that, I think attention, in fact, should be considered part of human integrity. It's interesting to see that in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, you have data in article, I don't remember which article, but the notion of personal data and the right to protect personal data is enshrined in the Charter. The attention, not at all, but I think integrity is a principle. But integrity is not only to remain behind the door of your house. I think the integrity, attention has to be seen as a component of integrity. Okay, so all this, you can read more there. There is an On Life manifesto, and I've developed this with Hannah Arendt, so this is my contribution, but these 12 scholars I've had the privilege to gather them, and it was a process. We agreed. Originally, I was a rapporteur of this group. So my task was supposed to be to write the report, which is a nightmare. Because you write alone, and then they say yes or no. And it turned totally differently. It's emerging logic. The chair, Luciano Floridi, between two meetings, we had 5 meetings, and between each 2 meetings, he said, please write 1,000 words, 1K, he called them. So between 2 meetings, we were writing 1K's contribution. And these individual chapters are, in fact, the 5K that were produced in the process. So these are endorsed individually, but have been produced in the process in a shared way. And here in the center, you have a short text of 7 pages that we have there agreed all together. But of course, because they are philosophers, on some words they had comments. So they were allowed to put commentaries to sort of explain the distance they like to take with the text. But so this outcome is really a joint text, endorsed by all with these commentaries, and then individual contribution that has fed into this, because this was really developed during the process. So it was really an interesting process. Thank you.